Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. The bond between sisters can be a strong one, but the bond between twin sisters, it's hard for me to imagine. From the very moment twin sisters exit their mother's womb, those little girls are together. So many life-changing milestones are experienced in near lockstep. Your first steps, your first Easter dress, your first day of school. And for each milestone that is not experienced at the same time, well, it becomes a point of comparison. One twin's life is always in stark relief next to the other. You can't help but compare and contrast yourself to them. In a way, having a twin sister, identical or fraternal, must feel like seeing a different version of yourself. Like witnessing an alternate universe before your very eyes. One where you made different choices. And that could be very difficult. Some days, just staring in the mirror is hard enough. Imagine if that mirror was an entire person who, in a way, reflected your own choices, both good and bad, back at you. In today's case, we have twin sisters, who, though they were very close, were incredibly different people. They were two unique individuals. They each had their own hopes, dreams, and goals. But in May of 1992, they became unified in one mission. And that mission was either to mastermind the murder of one twin's husband, Dr. Jack Wilson, or to prove that they were innocent. Welcome to episode 211, Evil or Innocent Twins, Betty, Peggy, and the Murder of Jack Wilson. Jack Ray Wilson was born in May of 1937 to parents Werda and William in Chicago, Illinois. Jack's father's side of the family was originally from England. His grandfather was nationalized in 1873 when he was 6 years old. By the age of 33, Jack's father had landed in Chicago. He soon met the woman who would become Jack's mother, Werda. Werda and her family were primarily from Arkansas, though she herself had been born in Louisiana. William and Werda were wed in Chicago in March of 1933. 4 years later, they welcomed Jack. His little sister was born in 1943. By that time, Jack and his family were living in Oklahoma City. His father was working in a restaurant called Jake's Cowshed. Jack's father, William, then served in World War II, mercifully making it home to his family when so many other young men didn't. William passed away in February of 1963 when he was 66 years old and Jack was only 26. That is still a very young age to lose your dad, and it had to be hard. Despite, or perhaps because of whatever hardships and grief he had known, Jack had grown up to be a clever, charming, and kind young man. And he put all of that to good use in his choice of a career as a doctor. The year before, in 1962, Jack had earned his Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Tennessee College of Medicine. He had been in the top 10% of his class. I'm so glad Mr. Wilson lived long enough to see his son become a doctor. Around this same time, Jack married his first wife. Her name was Julia. In August 1962, they tied the knot in Memphis and had several children together, though they eventually divorced. Friends said the divorce was amicable, with shared custody of the kids. Jack adored his children and spent as much time with them as he could. Growing in his career, Jack, who was probably more well known as Dr. Wilson, specialized his medical practice and became an ophthalmologist. which is different from an optometrist. An optometrist is your primary eye care doctor, while an ophthalmologist is a specialist who treats more complex medical issues related to the eyes. Early on, and for the rest of his career, Dr. Wilson was revered as a kind and generous man who would often waive expensive bills for patients who could not afford them. By the late 1970s, 40-something Jack met a pretty nurse named Betty at work. She was in her early 30s with brown hair and brown eyes. Betty later wrote in old Huntsville magazine that Jack flirted so much he called her brown eyes in front of patients. Jack and Betty hit it off right away. It was love at first sight. According to Betty, they only went on 2 dates before deciding to live together. Betty had also already gone through a divorce and had children of her own. She worked several different kinds of jobs to pay the bills before being encouraged to attend nursing school. Once she did, she found her calling, at least until she became a doctor's wife and quit her job. Betty Gay Woods and her fraternal sister, Peggy Joy Woods, were born in July of 1945 to parents Lloyd and Nell in Gadsden, Alabama. Betty and Peggy were the youngest of 4 daughters in the Woods family. By the time Betty and Peggy were 5 years old in 1950, their father was a city patrolman on the Gadsden police force. Betty said their mother worked in a factory and described them as a typical lower-middle-class family. In 1964, Betty and Peggy graduated from Gadsden High School. At the time of their commencement, the 18-year-olds were both smart, well-liked, and accomplished young women, though it's clear their interests were different. Betty had been on the student council. She had participated in the drama club, Future Business Leaders of America, the Red Cross, the Powder Puff football team, and more. Peggy participated in many of the same clubs as Betty, including FBLA, but Peggy had also been heavily involved in the school choirs. And Peggy had been recognized as the school's homecoming queen 2 years in a row. She had also won 2 beauty pageants. According to Steve Means, a former classmate of the Woods sisters who spoke with Snapped, Peggy was perceived as the debutante. She excelled. She was the homecoming queen. Betty was more average, but they always appeared to get along just fine. As the years went on, Peggy graduated from Auburn University in Montgomery, Alabama, and she became an elementary school teacher for the Shelby County School District, which is just south of Birmingham. By 1985, Peggy had also married and divorced, then remarried to a man named Wayne Lowe. Wayne was the minister of music for the First Baptist Church in Vincent, Alabama, and Peggy taught Bible classes at that same church and was lead singer in the choir. Wayne adopted her 2 kids from her first marriage, and they had 2 more together. In all, 3 daughters and a son. Meanwhile, Betty had married her childhood sweetheart, had a couple of children, and quickly divorced, explaining they both knew they were just too young. She later describes her first apartment on her own and partying a lot, mainly because later books about her life would go into her past. It all changed when Betty became a nurse and met Dr. Jack Wilson. As I said, they moved in together after a couple of dates and married just 9 months after Jack's first divorce. In 1978, everything changed again, very gravely, when Jack had to have a serious surgery. He had long suffered with Crohn's disease. It's a type of inflammatory bowel disease that causes swelling in your digestive tract. It's a very painful disease, sometimes requiring surgery like it did for Jack. Jack had a colostomy. It's a procedure that alters the path of food waste as it moves through your body. Essentially, they put a hole in your large intestine and reroute your fecal matter to exit your body through a plastic bag, which is known as a colostomy bag. A short time after Jack had this surgery on July 6, 1978, 41-year-old Jack and 33-year-old Betty married. Their nuptials took place in Huntsville, Alabama. At first, their relationship appeared idyllic. A former friend of Betty's, Robbie Smith, told Snapped, "I thought she had a wonderful life, and the man she was married to was a wonderful man. She always seemed to be really happy." Plus, as the years went by, they were rich. Jack earned a high income as a doctor, so Betty was able to quit her job. They drove Mercedes and BMW vehicles. They lived in an extremely nice 4-bedroom, 3.5-bathroom home on a near acre of land. And this home was located in a fancy neighborhood called Boulder Circle. Boulder Circle was where many of the local Huntsville doctors and other highly paid people lived. Newspapers often listed Jack and Betty as being from Boulder Circle rather than Huntsville, as if suggesting living in Boulder Circle meant something entirely different than living elsewhere in Huntsville. And I guess it kind of was. Jack showered his wife with lavish gifts, but was more of a simple, eccentric man himself. Jack's son Steve and some family friends talked to People magazine about how funny and quirky he was, wearing Christmas ties in the summer. And he loved to eat peanut butter out of the jar, which his son claimed irritated Betty. Despite what Steve said, outwardly, they seemed to have a wonderful life together. But of course, money doesn't mean your life is perfect. And Betty and Jack weren't without their problems. Betty struggled with alcoholism. She later said she drank a lot because she felt inferior and nervous in their wealthy social circles. Bloody Mary brunches and martini lunches, as she put it. And she was also careful to explain that when drinking, she said many things which were out of character for her. Quote, "When I was drunk, I would say horrible and nasty things, often attacking the people who loved me the most." In 1986, 8 years into their marriage, Betty quit drinking and joined Alcoholics Anonymous. She said it was the best thing that ever happened to her. She became well known in AA as a role model and was very kind to others. That's not just from her viewpoint, others said it as well. But around the same time, rumors began whispering around Huntsville that Betty was having extramarital affairs, and Betty fully admitted the rumors were true. Later, Betty would insist that she and Jack were basically in an open marriage. She claimed that Jack had urged her to pursue other men romantically, as his one true love was his job. But it's not 100% clear if this was true or if Betty was altering history after the fact. She wrote, quote, "Like all marriages, ours had its problems, but strangely enough, none of them had to do with sex. Jack and I were both grown people who believed that what we did in our bedroom was our own business as long as both of us agreed. Yes, I had affairs, but I never cheated, and neither did Jack." That sounds strange, like an oxymoron. You had affairs, but you didn't cheat? I think what she means is what in modern culture we now call emotional cheating. Affairs were just sex, but she never emotionally cheated on her husband. A few sources indicated that Jack approved of Betty's affairs, but none of these sources that I could find are from Jack himself or those close to Jack. However, whether or not he explicitly consented, it's likely Jack was aware that Betty was seeing other men. Betty would later write an essay for Old Huntsville magazine, and she seemed to be creatively tailoring her story. I was careful about quotes I drew from it, because it's hard to know what is the truth, and of course, Jack isn't around to explain his side. In 1986, one of Betty's friends, Brenda, experienced a tragedy. Brenda's husband, who was also a close friend of Jack's and a doctor, had died by suicide. Not long after it happened, Betty approached Brenda. She asked Brenda if she had killed her husband. The question shocked and hurt Brenda. She later testified that she replied, "No, Betty, you know he had suicidal tendencies, and besides, I was in love with him." But Betty kept asking Brenda if she killed her husband. According to Brenda, Betty repeatedly said, "You know you can tell me." Finally, Brenda broke down and began to cry. It was then that Betty said, "I want to kill Jack. Can you help me?" In response, Brenda suggested that Betty divorce Jack. But according to Brenda, Betty refused. She knew that a divorce meant she would lose her wealth and lavish lifestyle. Betty told Brenda that she envied how Brenda had inherited her husband's estate, and Betty said she would rather be a widow than a divorcee. Later in court, Brenda would admit that Betty was drunk during this conversation, and Brenda hadn't taken the conversation seriously, which is probably why she didn't contact the police. But following this conversation, Brenda did distance herself from Betty. By the year 1992, onlookers could tell that the Wilsons' once perfect marriage had turned sour. They slept in separate bedrooms, which is more common than most people think, but it was still a black mark against Betty because of the rumors about her affairs. But even worse, Betty spoke poorly about Jack to others, and often. Once, she asked Jack's bookkeeper to give him a message, and then she made, quote, a rude hand gesture at the bookkeeper. I can imagine what that was. A different woman who worked at Jack's office also heard Betty say she would rather be a well-respected widow than a divorcee, just like Betty had previously told Brenda. Also, Betty would refer to Jack's colostomy bag as his shit bag. Steve Wilson, Jack's son, told People magazine that she also called his father shitbag. He said Betty was sick of her husband and didn't want to go anywhere with him. And she was not subtle about her extramarital affairs. The Wilsons' housekeeper testified that Betty sometimes brought these men to her home, and it's not like Betty couldn't afford a hotel room. Toward the end of May of 1992, Jack and Betty were preparing to take a vacation to Santa Fe, New Mexico. They planned to leave on Monday, May 24th, but on Friday, May 21st, the unthinkable happened. At about 9:30 p.m., Betty arrived home from an AA meeting, and she discovered her 55-year-old husband, Dr. Jack Wilson, lying in a large pool of blood at the top of their stairwell. He appeared lifeless. Betty dropped everything she was holding and ran to a neighbor's house and called 911. She explained that it looked like Jack had been attacked. There was a police officer who had just finished responding to a different call about 6 blocks away. He arrived at Betty and Jack's home within minutes and secured the crime scene. When more investigators arrived, they confirmed what was now obvious. Jack Wilson was dead. As the officers looked over the crime scene, they noted that Jack was positioned on his back. He had been severely beaten and stabbed multiple times in his torso. He had been bludgeoned to death. Both of his arms were broken as he had tried to defend himself. There was blood all around him and splattered on a wall, and a bloody aluminum bat lay about 5 feet away from his body. According to forensic pathologist Dr. Joseph Embry, Jack died from a mix of the gruesome head injuries and the stab wounds. There was no sign of forced entry, but that doesn't mean the same thing here as it might in a different case. Jack was widely known for being very trusting. Neighbors reported that he often left his doors unlocked, which isn't as outlandish as it sounds. Boulder Circle was an incredibly safe neighborhood. It wasn't uncommon for residents there to leave their doors unlocked. But for the record, there wasn't any kind of major CSI-type investigation of the Wilson house like we're used to hearing about and seeing on TV. That will become more clear later. Police interviewed Betty. She said that evening she had been out shopping. She had purchased a new pair of sneakers from a department store at the Parkway City Mall. These sneakers had a distinct floral pattern. Afterward, she had gone to her AA meeting. Betty was candid with police about the state of her marriage. She said it was not always a happy one. She implied that Jack's struggle with Crohn's disease, his surgery, and colostomy bag had made it challenging for them to have a fulfilling sex life. Still, the detectives did not suspect Betty, at least not for a few days, until they received a notification about an anonymous tip. According to the Anniston Star, a Shelby County man named James had been bragging about killing a man in Huntsville. Upon hearing this, the Huntsville Police Department contacted Shelby County law enforcement. They found James, and he confessed. James Dennison White was born in 1941, and according to his own testimony, he only had an 8th grade education. When James was approaching 30 years old in the late 1960s, he had served in the Army during the Vietnam War, but he was dishonorably discharged after he attacked his own troops. Later, his attorney would call that incident a mental collapse. Afterward, James would go on to abuse drugs and alcohol for more than 20 years. He would be in and out of mental hospitals as many as 7 times, and he had been incarcerated for auto theft and drug-related charges. On one occasion, he had escaped from a work release program. By the time he was 51 in the year 1992, he had been married and divorced 4 times, and he had 4 children. At some point, he had suffered some injuries during a workplace incident. So by this time, he was inconsistently employed. When he did work, it was primarily as a handyman or construction worker. That's actually how James first became involved in all of this. He was doing some carpentry work for his daughter's school in Vincent, Alabama. And that's how James crossed paths with Betty's twin sister, the 1st grade teacher, Mrs. Peggy Lowe. James was building shelves at Peggy's school, and he and Peggy developed a friendship. The nature of James and Peggy's friendship is highly debated. According to James, he and Peggy developed romantic feelings for each other. They spoke on the phone a great deal. During those calls, Peggy confided in James that she was unhappy in her marriage. On one occasion, she proclaimed her love for James. As James tells it, he and Peggy kissed multiple times and had sex once. But according to interviews and court testimony, Peggy has always steadfastly denied this alleged romantic relationship. However, she could not deny some of the phone calls, as there were phone company records. But Peggy claimed it was mostly about his carpentry work, and she was just friendly with him, listening to his troubles. She had no idea that James was infatuated with her, and she certainly did not return his affection. Sure, Peggy and her husband had hired James to build cabinets for their home, but that was because they knew James needed the cash, not because Peggy was interested in a relationship with him. This is the beginning of an ongoing theme for today's case. James White says this happened, while Peggy Lowe and Betty Wilson say no, this happened, and never the twain shall meet. To start, we'll go through James' side of the story. Then we'll cover Peggy and Betty's. According to James, Peggy told him in secret that she had a, quote, friend who was in a bad relationship. Peggy explained that this friend had a sick and abusive husband. and Peggy wanted James to, quote, resolve the problem by putting him away. There sure were a lot of euphemisms thrown around, a hallmark of Southern ladies for sure. But James read between the lines, he said. He knew that Peggy wanted someone killed, though for a while he thought Peggy's friend was merely another euphemism referring to herself. James figured she wanted Wayne Lowe dead. It wasn't until March of 1992 that he realized Peggy's friend was her twin sister Betty, and that the husband was none other than Dr. Jack Wilson. In James's recorded confession with the police, he said about Peggy, quote, I was trying to win her love and affection. She was putting me in a crack to prove myself to her. It started as a joke, but she kept calling and pushing me to get something done to help her sister. Eventually, James told Peggy that he had connections and could arrange for Jack's murder. But James was lying about his so-called connections, as he would be the one to do the deed. From late March to early April of 1992, James and Peggy orchestrated the details of Jack's death. After some negotiation, Peggy offered James $5,000 for the job. That's nearly $11,000 in today's money. It's still a low amount for a hitman for a doctor worth millions. But of course, James is always described as drug-addicted, alcoholic, destitute, unhoused, and always desperate for quick cash. In April, Peggy called James. She informed him that Betty had given her half of the money as a down payment. Peggy gave this $2,500 to James. James, who was in deep financial straits, used the money to pay some past due bills. Next, he deposited $500 in his bank account, which had been overdrawn by $400 up until that moment. Then he spent the rest of the money on his 4 children. By the end of April, James had spent every last penny of that $2,500. Approximately 2 weeks later, on Friday, May 15, 1992, James and Peggy met in person. Peggy had stayed home from school that day, and according to James, they had sex. Afterward, Peggy pressured James to kill Jack. She said that if he didn't finish the job, someone would have to repay Betty's $2,500. But James told Peggy he couldn't kill Jack without more money. Traveling from Vincent to Huntsville was more than he could afford. And of course, he had spent all of that down payment of $2,500. Now Peggy and Betty had to figure out a way to get James more money. So Peggy instructed James to go to Lake Guntersville State Park, which is about an hour from Huntsville. Betty had an AA meeting in a building there, so her black BMW would be parked near the entrance of the park. James was to open the back door of the BMW, which would be left unlocked, and on the back seat would be a book. The book would have enough money hidden in its pages to finance his trip to Huntsville. Then, James could kill Jack. On Saturday, May 16th, James tried to do just that. But a security guard for the state park would not let him enter. I guess the guard could tell that the unkempt James was up to no good. James explained to the security guard that he needed to get a book from Betty's car. He told the guard that he had traveled a long way to get there. Still, the guard refused to let him enter. The guard said that James could call Betty on a payphone at a service station located several miles from the park's entrance. James went to the payphone, but he didn't call Betty. She was in that AA meeting, and he didn't have the number. It's 1992. We weren't in that everyone has a cell phone age quite yet. Instead, James called Peggy, and Peggy told James to call the front desk to try to reach Betty. James did, and was able to leave Betty a message. Then, he returned to the Lake Guntersville State Park and waited by the entrance. Betty retrieved the book entitled The Sleeping Beauty and the Firebird from her back seat, and she gave it to a security guard. Then, the guard brought the book to James. James now had the book and the $100 bill inside of it, so he went to Huntsville. He drove past Jack and Betty's home in Boulder Circle. Then James returned to his own home in Vincent. No more than 2 days later, Betty called James. She asked him, as reported by court documents, what the fuck was going on. Betty was angry that James had not yet killed Jack. At this time, it was around Monday, May 18th, and Betty wanted Jack out of her way by the next Monday. That's when they were supposed to go on vacation in New Mexico, and Betty did not want to go. James told Betty that he couldn't kill Jack because he couldn't get cartridges for his gun. So on Wednesday, May 20th, Peggy called James. She said she had, quote, the tool and the equipment to do the job. It was at this point that James, Betty, and Peggy met together at the Logan Martin Dam. Betty and Peggy arrived in Betty's black BMW. Peggy got out of the car with a sweater in her hand. Hidden in the sweater was a .38 caliber revolver. Peggy opened the door to James's truck and put the gun in his back seat. Then James returned to his home in Vincent. He wrapped the gun in a brown towel and stashed it under some boards in an abandoned house next door to his mobile home. At this point, the sisters told James they would call him. Then early on the morning of Thursday, May 21st, Betty called James. It was time to kill Jack, who was at his office. James was supposed to bring the gun, shoot Jack, and be done with it. But when James went to Jack's office, he decided he couldn't kill him there. There were too many people around. So James went to a payphone and called Peggy's number, but Betty picked up. She was staying at Peggy's house. James explained the situation, and he said he needed more money so he could spend the night in Huntsville, presumably to kill Jack the next day. Betty told James to meet her at the Parkway City Mall at noon. They would rendezvous at the mall's Chick-fil-A, and Betty would give James more money. James did as he was told. He ordered a sandwich from a young woman named Christina, and then went and sat on a bench outside to eat it. Betty arrived, ordered food, and then went outside to James's bench. She handed him a bag with another $100 bill inside of it. Then, James went to a Kmart to purchase a few travel items. He bought a travel kit and underwear. Then he checked into the Ramada Inn. James decided to drive by Betty and Jack's house once more to check the layout of the property. To do this, James pretended to be a jogger and ran by the house. But he was wearing jeans. He stuck out like a sore thumb, so people noticed him. After this, James returned to the Ramada Inn and called Peggy. The next morning, Betty called James. I have to wonder if she asked the same question. What the fuck was going on? Because it really seemed like James was dragging his feet. James told Betty that he needed her to drive him to the house so that no one would see him. So Betty and James met again at the Parkway City Mall. It was about 3 p.m. on Friday, and James got into Betty's BMW. As he did, he noticed Betty wore flowery tennis shoes. Then he crouched down onto the floor of her BMW, and Betty drove him to her house. Betty pulled into her garage, handed James $40, and told him where Jack's bedroom was on the second floor. Jack wasn't at home, so the plan was for James to lie in wait. He would ambush Jack when he got home, take some valuables to make it look like a burglary, and then leave and call Betty to come and get him. James had not brought the gun that Peggy and Betty gave him. He said he thought it would cause a racket. Also, he said he was gun-shy after his stint in Vietnam. Instead, James remembered having a rope. After this, he waited on the second floor of the Wilsons' home for several hours. Either before he got to the Wilsons' home or while he was there, James drank a case of beer and took 15 caffeine pills. This was in addition to his normally prescribed medication one of which was lithium. When Jack and James crossed paths, both men were surprised. James hadn't heard Jack arrive home, which isn't shocking if you consider his state of mind. Jack had probably been at home for at least a few minutes. He had gotten a bat from the garage and used it to pound a sign in his front yard for a political campaign. Jack was still holding the bat as he walked up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, outside his own bedroom, Jack ran into James. When retelling the event, James said, "I didn't hear him come in, and we were face to face, and he grabbed me, and I freaked out. I kept reaching until I found something, and I hit him until he turned me loose, and then I ran." James later testified that he blanked out for much of the murder itself. He couldn't be sure if he had or had not stabbed Jack with a knife. He wasn't even sure if he had brought a knife. The next thing James recalled was being in the woods behind Betty and Jack's home. Then he changed his clothes, buried the bag of bloody clothes in the woods, and returned to the house. He called Betty, who came and got him and drove him back to his truck, which was still at the Parkway City Mall. After all of this, James was supposed to receive the remaining $2,500 on Sunday. The money was supposed to be in Peggy's garage. But when James got to Peggy's garage, the money was not there. And this is where James's story ended. James was arrested after his confession. He was booked into the Huntsville City Jail on Wednesday, May 27, 1992, 5 days after Dr. Wilson was murdered. At the time of James's arrest, the police were keeping his confession under wraps. Meanwhile, Betty and Peggy were staying with their older sister and her husband. When Betty and Peggy learned that James was arrested, their brother-in-law testified later that the sisters did not show a reaction. On Tuesday, May 26th, there was a memorial service for the beloved Dr. Jack Ray Wilson. His body was cremated, and the ashes were distributed to his friends and family. That same evening, Huntsville detectives went and picked up his widow, Betty Wilson, for a formal talk at the station. Her twin sister Peggy was also brought in and questioned in a separate room. They were allowed to leave that night and spent the night together again, which I gotta say is again some crackerjack police work. Allowing two supposed co-conspirators to spend the night together to get their stories straight? On Thursday, May 28th, the 46-year-old twins, Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe, were arrested, and according to Madison County District Attorney Mo Brooks, the women tried to avoid the police for at least 20 minutes before allowing themselves to be taken into custody. Betty later wrote in her essay for Old Huntsville magazine, it was because they had spent the night at their sister's again, and then she spent some time with a friend running errands, then she and Peggy were washing their clothes at his house. This was because Peggy's home and fresh clothes were 110 miles away in Vincent, Alabama, and Betty's clothes were at the crime scene. Betty is pictured wearing a man's pajama shirt, which she said only added to her cheating femme fatale persona in the press. Rich bitch who had affairs arrested for murder, she called the photos, which seemed to be in every paper. Peggy is pictured as well, but she managed to get her dress back on, and her arrest photo wasn't splashed everywhere as much as Betty's. The women were then held in the Madison County Jail. They immediately and vehemently denied everything. If convicted, Betty, Peggy, and James White all faced either death by electric chair or life in prison without parole. This was considered a capital offense for both Betty and Peggy because it was a contract for hire murder. And it was doubly a capital offense for James. He had both participated in the conspiracy and killed Jack. On Thursday, June 4th, Peggy was granted a bond of $150,000. Her church and community raised the money, and she walked out of jail that same day. It was pretty straightforward. Betty's bond hearing, which came after Peggy's, was not so simple. She was denied bond because as a wealthy woman, she had the means to flee. But the attorney's teeth were already bared looking for blood in this first hearing. DA Mo Brooks pointed to James White's confession as a clear indicator of Betty's guilt. He said, "What other reason would you have for a stranger to come to Huntsville from Shelby County and murder Dr. Wilson, have complete access to his home, and steal nothing except for the explanation he's given?" Betty's lawyers claimed she was innocent. They thought she should be allowed to post her bail and leave. To prove this, they pointed to inconsistencies in James's story. And there were quite a few inconsistencies. By the time everything was said and done, it was determined that James actually had 58 inconsistencies in his initial taped confession, some of which were outright lies. There isn't any one document that details each one of these inconsistencies and lies, but some are simple and some were even published early in the papers, like how James had lied about how he received his first payment of $2,500 from Peggy. Initially, he said that it was on the side of the road. Then he claimed it was delivered in a different manner. I omitted that detail earlier just for clarity. When James testified in court with the version of events I provided to you, he swore that it was the truth, but his credibility was damaged. The arrests of James, Betty, and Peggy obviously had not led to clear answers, so the police continued their investigation into Jack's death. The first and foremost important part was motive. Jack Wilson had been worth $6.3 million. That's 13.7 million reasons today. When Jack died, most of his estate was set to be inherited by his wife, Betty. And 2 months before Jack was killed, he had taken out an additional $1 million life insurance policy. This was in addition to the 6 other insurance policies that would have paid Betty approximately $135,000. Add to all of this the general perception that Betty didn't especially like or love her husband, and well, the case against Betty seemed like a slam dunk to most. Plus, in the days following Jack's death, before Betty was arrested, she had withdrawn $60,000 from her and Jack's joint bank accounts. Most of that money was deposited into her personal checking account. Shortly after, Jack's children sued to freeze his assets. And the courts complied, including his joint accounts with Betty. The authorities wondered if Mrs. Peggy Lowe was also motivated by money. She was a public school teacher. Her husband was the musical director of a church. They definitely were not wealthy people. If Betty shared some of her inheritance from Jack's estate with Peggy, it could have been life-changing. And there are some shows and stories that suggest Peggy often spent time with her wealthy sister and dreamed of that life too. As a whole, law enforcement officers tended to believe James's version of what happened. And that's because the police had found the gun registered to Betty Wilson. It was hidden under the floorboards of the abandoned house next to James's mobile home, just where he said it would be. And James had correctly identified that Betty was wearing floral sneakers on the day Jack was killed. Betty had already used the sneakers and the receipt for them as part of her alibi on the day Jack was murdered. James said he saw the sneakers when he hid in the floorboard of her car as she drove him to the house to kill her husband. Sneakers that Betty had purchased only hours before the murder happened. Remember, witnesses from the AA meeting Betty had attended also noticed the floral sneakers. Mainly because Betty was known to dress up, and she was dressed very casual on this evening. In the year leading up to the court proceedings, Huntsville, Alabama was on fire with this case. The press went wild. Rumor had it the DA's office and police were leaking lots of information to the media. Everyone and their mama had an opinion on it. Had a drunk, drug-addled hitman killed the beloved Dr. Jack Wilson at the behest of his cheating wife? Or was James just a fool who was in love with Peggy Lowe, a respected lady who appeared to be happily married and was very religious? And if James had fabricated all of this, why on earth had he decided to kill Peggy's sister's husband? Was it a robbery gone wrong? If so, why hadn't he taken anything of value from the house? The police noted that Jack's wallet was next to his shoes on the floor. The cash was gone, but the credit cards were still there. 2 guns and VCRs were left in plain sight in the Wilson home, and a ski mask was found on Jack's bed. There was 1 gun case that was empty and left open, though, along with some ammunition. Could it be the case for the gun James claimed the sisters brought to him? Or had James himself stolen the gun during the robbery gone wrong theory? At this point, no one knew Betty or Peggy's side of the story, other than they maintained their innocence. But the confusion surrounding this case added more fuel to the fire. It was salacious, with the perfect ingredients of sex and money. Producers and writers came out of the woodwork, preparing to create TV shows, films, and books about this spectacular case. Betty's attorney said she turned down up to 20 offers to sell her story. But it's likely she didn't do that for moral reasons. A local bank had sued Betty. They accused her of killing Dr. Jack Wilson to inherit his estate, and if she received any royalties from a movie or book deal involving Jack's murder, this lawsuit meant that she would have to pay South Trust Bank $20 million. But Jack's family did not face these same concerns. And the Anniston Star reported that Jack's sons from a previous marriage had agreed to a 6-figure deal for working with an unnamed Beverly Hills production company. They were going to make a made-for-TV movie entitled Black Widows, the Alabama Twins Murder. There isn't a TV movie by that name, but there is one called Separated by Murder, starring Sharon Gless as both twins. The names were changed to Lily Mae and Holly Faye. It's on the free app Crackle if you're a TV movie junkie like me. But if you're Southern, be forewarned about the fake accents. They're sugary enough to give you a toothache. Anyway, while all of this is happening, Peggy Lowe was living her life normally. She had been removed from the classroom by the Shelby County School Board, but they still allowed her to do administrative tasks as a special assignments teacher in the central office. She went to church, she ate breakfast with her kids, she cooked her family dinner at night. Meanwhile, Betty remained in jail. Betty's attorneys alleged that the authorities kept her in solitary confinement and that they denied her access to her watch and writing materials. James was also in jail, but he, unlike Betty, did not use his attorneys to lodge public complaints. And if you hadn't had your fill of drama yet, there was more. This was an election year for Huntsville's Madison County District Attorney. The sitting DA was Mo Brooks, and his competitor was Tim Morgan. Tim just happened to be a very close friend of Dr. Jack Wilson, and Mo had made untoward comments that Betty had been campaigning for Tim on the day that Jack was killed. I'm not certain what the exact comment Mo made was, though I think I get the meaning. And by August 24th, 1992, Mo had to issue a public apology. That November, Mo Brooks lost his DA seat to Tim Morgan in a bitter election. And then, Tim could not prosecute any cases relating to Jack's murder. His close relationship to Dr. Wilson was a conflict of interest. As a result, the courts called upon the nearby Limestone County DA, Jimmy Fry, for Betty Wilson's trial. She was to be the first of the 3 trials. Jimmy Fry told the Huntsville Times, quote, "Someone asked me, how are you going to prepare for this case? And I started to tell them I'd take up bungee jumping." Betty Wilson's trial began in February of 1993. They held it in Tuscaloosa County rather than Huntsville's Madison County due to extensive pretrial publicity. The prosecution subpoenaed nearly 70 witnesses, and Betty's 4 defense attorneys had prepared 100 witnesses of their own. The state's case was easy to follow. Betty didn't like her husband, Jack, but she did like his money, so she planned and facilitated his murder to inherit the bulk of his fortune. The prosecution painted Betty as a vain, unfaithful wife who believed she deserved her husband's fortune. Limestone County's DA, Jimmy Fry, said in court, though it appeared she had everything, she wanted more. And not just more, she wanted it all, and she wanted it now. The state brought many of Betty's own friends to testify. These friends claimed that Betty was known for saying hateful things to and about Jack. These are the comments she would later write about in Old Huntsville magazine that she attributed to her drinking problem. Some of Betty's lovers testified, confirming that she had relationships with men outside of her marriage, which Betty never denied. She claimed Jack knew and approved. And James White also took the stand. He regaled the jury with the rendition of events I told you earlier. And then the state brought out numerous witnesses that corroborated James's story. Bank workers verified that James had indeed received an influx of cash in April of 1992. They confirmed that he had paid off some bills and deposited $500. The teller even remembered that she had seen James with a wad of about $1,000 in cash that he didn't deposit with her, indicating that James might have spent that sum on his children later, just as he had said. 2 security guards from the Lake Gunnersville State Park testified that yes, James had come to the state park on that day. One guard said he was the one to turn James away, and the other guard had been given the book from Betty and then delivered it to James. The front desk clerk also confirmed that a man had called and left a message for Betty, who was at her AA meeting. Additionally, telephone records from the payphone at the nearby service station showed that someone had called Peggy's home. The corroborations just kept coming and coming. The book that James said Betty had given him, which was found in his home, was checked out in Betty's name at the library. There was, as I mentioned, Betty's gun that was hidden near James's home. His bloody shoes were also found there. On the same day and at the same time that James alleged he, Betty, and Peggy met at the Logan Martin Dam to hand off the gun, Peggy and Betty said they had left their friend's house to get ice cream and rent videos together, but they didn't have any proof of this trip. The manager of the Chick-fil-A at Parkway City Mall, where James and Betty had met, confirmed that a woman named Christina did work on that particular day, and that's the same name of the woman that James told authorities gave him his sandwich. A Kmart employee testified that after midnight on May 21st, a man came in and bought a travel kit, underwear, and a few more items. That man paid for these purchases with a $100 bill, just like the one James alleged Betty had given him following their Chick-fil-A handoff. A Ramada Inn manager confirmed that James had spent the night there and made several telephone calls from his rooms. Phone records confirmed these calls were to Peggy's house. A neighbor of Betty and Jack's testified that he had seen a man wearing jeans jogging by their Boulder Circle home. The unknown jeans-wearing man stopped in front of the Wilsons' home. And one of Peggy's neighbors testified that, 2 days after Jack's murder, she had seen James in Peggy's garage, which lined up with what he said that he had been there to retrieve the other half of the $5,000, but it wasn't there. A mall department store manager also testified on the day Jack was murdered, May 22nd at 2:11 p.m., Betty had bought a pair of floral pattern tennis shoes, the same shoes Jack saw as he crouched down in her BMW. And a neighbor of Betty's testified that she saw James limping in the direction of the Wilson home at 5 p.m. on the day Jack was killed. She remembered him especially well because she was driving her daughter and her daughter's friends to their softball game, and the young girls in the car were joking about how strange this man looked. If you're thinking, okay, we get it. Seems like James White's story holds up. I understand. I do. But some people don't think James White's story holds up, and here's why. Because Betty's defense team, and later on Peggy's defense team too, asserted that while some of the details of James's story could be true, none of this was a conspiracy to kill Jack Wilson. They argued that James had done this all on his own. These numerous meetups and circumstances that perfectly aligned with James's story were all an effort for Peggy and Betty to get James more handyman work. They felt sorry for him and were just trying to help him out. They were talking about cabinets or bookshelves or something, not murder. And James had misinterpreted what was supposed to be an actual job as a hit job. It's just all innocent coincidences, y'all. As bad as it looks, this argument does hold some weight in a court of law, because it's not illegal for Betty to give James a book through a weird exchange of hands at her AA meeting. It's not illegal for James to call Peggy. It's not illegal for him to buy things at Kmart and stay at the Ramada Inn. None of these checkpoints in James's stories that aligned with the people who would have interacted with him were illegal at all. The question was this: was James White's version of events entirely true? Or was he telling just enough of the truth to get Peggy and Betty in trouble while changing the key details? Was this man with an 8th grade education, no steady work, with a self-admitted substance abuse problem truly that clever? The defense just needed there to be reasonable doubt to get Betty off the hook. And at the end of the day, there was no physical evidence that Betty and Peggy had conspired to kill Jack. Betty being mean to Jack just wasn't enough. Hell, maybe James had stolen Betty's gun and her library book. After all, he had been in the Wilson home. I'm not sure how this would explain how James could describe Betty's floral shoes, though. But are floral shoes enough to send someone to prison? Betty's defense counsel also argued that James had changed his confession after the fact. They suggested that he had fixed those inconsistencies we discussed before. His dates had been slightly shifted, his times altered. Additionally, Betty's defense team portrayed James White as an unreliable source. They attributed his behavior to mental health issues, dismal military history, and recorded criminal activity. Betty's defense team also brought a surprise witness. His name was David Williamson, and David was a salesman selling sports photos. Per David's testimony, he was at the Ramada Inn on the afternoon of May 22, 1992. David claimed he witnessed James there at about 4 p.m., and James had been rambling about making, quote, "that bitch pay for what she's done to me." According to David, James said, "I'll show her what lonely is all about." Apparently, James was shaking, and this behavior frightened David. This was important because it put a kink in James's timeline. At 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon, James said he was waiting in the Wilsons' home. In rebuttal, the prosecution suggested that David Williamson was providing false testimony for payment. They were suspicious as to why David had not come forward earlier. But David said that he only came forward out of chance. Apparently, Betty's attorney had just happened to contact him trying to buy sports photographs. And that's when David explained the interaction with James. Other witnesses brought by the defense poked holes in James's timeline. To this, the prosecution pretty much shrugged. James had been drunk and high. He wasn't wearing a watch. The state explained to the jury that it would be impossible to nail down the times with exact precision. Betty Wilson did not take the stand in her own defense. But Peggy took the stand at her sister's trial. Peggy insisted that she and Betty only wanted to hire James for handyman work, not murder. She was unflappably sincere and poised. After 6 days of testimony, the jury began deliberating on Tuesday, March 2nd, 1993. On Wednesday, after deliberating for about 10 hours, the jury found 47-year-old Betty Gay Woods Wilson guilty. One jury member told the AP News that while James's testimony was shaky at times, the evidence could not be denied. The juror said, "There was so much of it, time after time, we really couldn't come to any other verdict." Betty was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. DA Jimmy Fry had not sought the death penalty. He believed that, quote, "only the most heinous and obscene cases should have the death penalty imposed. Compared with other cases, this was not the most atrocious case I was aware of." Jack Wilson's kids might have disagreed. In total, the trial cost taxpayers more than $20,000, reported by the Birmingham Post-Herald. Betty herself spent $400,000 on her defense. That's about $850,000 today. After all, she had 4 defense attorneys on her team. An infamous dream team, and she still lost. Next came Peggy Lowe's trial. Limestone County DA Jimmy Fry did not prosecute her case due to his intense workload. Instead, Assistant Alabama Attorney General Don Valeska prosecuted. He, unlike Jimmy, was seeking the death penalty. Peggy's trial was also moved for publicity reasons, and it began on September 13th in Montgomery County, Alabama. Peggy's trial was just as high profile as Betty's. Her defense attorney argued that TV cameras should not be allowed in the courtroom. He thought it would pressure the jury, and a special ticketing process was created for seating. That way, they could control the people trying to pack themselves into the courtroom. Peggy's trial was nearly identical to Betty's. Only a few new items were brought to light. One was that the defense provided a new document. It was a letter from Jack dated January 3rd, 1992. He had been setting up a marital trust for Betty to receive the interest from. The trust was worth $600,000. The defense claimed that this showed Betty was fine financially. She hadn't conspired with her sister to kill Jack for his money. She had no reason to. But the prosecution argued that this document was actually the catalyst for Jack's murder. Receiving the interest of a $600,000 investment is a far cry from the $6.3 million plus insurance payouts that Betty would receive upon Jack's death. They claimed that upon hearing about Jack's half-hearted attempt to support her, Betty lost it. The next difference was Debbie Brannon, a witness for the defense. She operated a convenience store near Huntsville. Debbie testified that James and another man came in looking for work. James said he was doing some work for Dr. Jack Wilson and that he could reseal her parking lot. This provided more substance to the idea that James was only supposed to be doing handyman work for the Wilsons. The prosecution was flabbergasted that this woman did not testify at Betty's trial. She also had never spoken to the police investigating the case. Another big difference between Betty and Peggy's trial were the character witnesses. In Betty's trial, many witnesses spoke to how cruel Betty was to Jack. People who were former friends of Betty spoke very poorly of her on the stand. But in Peggy's trial, witness after witness proclaimed how warm-hearted, kind, and respected Peggy Lowe was. How she took people in without expecting anything in return. Peggy was depicted as a devout and faithful woman with a strong character. She had a parade of friends who testified and said so. And when she took the stand to testify in her own defense, that pristine persona poured out of Peggy as easily as sweet tea. Doris Flora, a former reporter for the Tuscaloosa News, said, "She came through as Mrs. Clean. She was beautiful, she was sweet, and it all came through in the trial." According to DA Don Valeska, Peggy's defense attorneys did their best to confuse the jurors. They presented a slew of new theories regarding Jack's death. They suggested that it wasn't a baseball bat that had been used to bludgeon him. They brought in an expert witness to suggest it was a different weapon, like a fireplace poker. When I saw this expert witness on the Forensic Files episode, he claimed the poker was missing from the Wilson home, and I had a painful flashback to the Michael Peterson case. The defense also suggested that Jack's body had been moved, and though he was found in a pool of blood, there wasn't blood spatter high up on the walls like you would expect. I admit, I do find that interesting. Unlike the Peterson trial, blood spatter evidence was not central to the case. It does seem unusual that there was only one splash of blood about a foot from the floor, considering all of Jack's horrific blunt force injuries. You would think the walls would be a bloodbath. But if you went down quickly, maybe the blood would not have splashed as high on the walls. I don't know. The defense proposed that multiple people had been involved in the murder itself. 2 men might have been able to carry Jack Wilson's body to the second floor. They were trying to further the theory that James and another man had gone there to rob the place because James knew they were rich, but the robbery went wrong and the men, for some reason, moved the body upstairs. The blood spatter stuff is interesting. The 2-man theory? I don't know. Why would James burn 2 innocent women instead of giving up a guilty man? Well, he later claimed he was harassed by police to give that version of events. Peggy's attorneys also accused James of being coached by the police during his taped confession, to which a detective later humorously pointed out, "If I was to do that, I would have told him the exact dates." But as to the 2-man theory, even without a real full crime scene investigation, the police would have found blood somewhere else. The idea that these criminals used a tarp to move him is just silly. Another forensic piece that didn't seem to hit was the lack of evidence in Betty's car if she really drove James White as he said she did. No fingerprints or other evidence of White ever being in her car was found. I imagine by the time the police searched her car, she had time to get it cleaned. It is still interesting, though. But it just didn't matter in either trial. Ultimately, Peggy's defense team's strategy worked because on Wednesday, September 22, 1993, 48-year-old Peggy Joy Woods Lowe was found not guilty. The jury had deliberated for 2.5 hours. Afterward, Peggy said, "I asked the Lord to send me a good lawyer, and he did." Her attorney, David Cromwell Johnson, was a bulldog. Known to be tenacious and flamboyant, he called David White everything he could think of, including a child molester on the Forensic Files episode on the case, a liar, a drug addict, doing dope, on and on. A prosecutor griped that trying to convict Peggy Lowe was like fighting God. As for the forensic problems the defense brought up, like that it might have been a fireplace poker instead of the bat and the blood spatter looked wrong, well, ADA Don Valeska said succinctly and southernly, quote, "It didn't make a damn how Dr. Wilson got killed. The question was who did it, and James White admitted to doing it, whether he stomped him, beat him with a bat, beat him with a stick, but that's the type of bull that experts try and sell to juries." I definitely see his point. I often talk about the battle of experts on this show. There's no argument how Dr. Wilson died. Valeska was trying to prove a conspiracy and strongly felt he had done so. You can see his anger in interviews. The problem was he was up against the Sunday school twin instead of the recovering alcoholic who admitted to multiple affairs and stood to inherit $6 million from her husband's death. But evidently, the fancy defense expert wasn't the problem. Jurors felt White lacked credibility, especially up against Peggy Lowe's sterling poise. After the trial, Peggy returned to her family and went back to teaching first grade. She told a reporter that she was looking forward to attending a high school football game to watch her daughter, who was a cheerleader. But despite Peggy's Teflon reputation, her marriage did not survive. Now known as Peggy Peck, she remarried to a University of Alabama professor. In early October of 1993, 42-year-old James Dennison White accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. After accepting the deal, James led investigators to the knife used to kill Jack Wilson. It was located under some rocks in Betty and Jack's yard. There was also his bloody clothes, gloves, and a rope in a plastic bag. I reckon a plea deal that saved his ass from the death penalty helped his memory. James was supposed to be considered eligible for parole in under 10 years, but that didn't happen. According to the Alabama Department of Corrections, James's next parole consideration date is March 1st, 2026. Currently, James White is incarcerated at the Red Eagle Work Center. He is considered to not pose a significant risk to himself or others. Meanwhile, Betty Wilson appealed her case in 1994, and for a time, it was thought that she might win. Betty's strongest appeal point was that, supposedly, James had retracted his confession. But when the appeal made its way through the courts, the judges were wary of overturning her case. James's supposed retraction had been delivered directly to one of Betty's attorneys. No one else was present. And James refused to comment on the retraction, using his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. Ultimately, the appeal was denied in a 5-2 decision in 1997. But if you are interested, his full statement is printed in the old Huntsville magazine I've referenced. He spins a yarn just like Betty did. In 2006, Betty married for a third time while in prison. She was wed to a former Green Beret named Bill Campbell. Her sister, Betty Woods Peck, stood as maid of honor. Today, Betty is 78 years old and still incarcerated at the Tutwiler prison. She will continue to not be considered for parole. Incidentally, the infamous Alabama axe murderess Viola Hyatt was once housed in the same prison, but she only served 10 years for the gruesome murder of 2 men. That's one of my favorite episodes. If you haven't heard it, it's number 131. Unlike Viola Hyatt, the motive is ridiculously obvious in this case. I think what makes it so sensational is that 2 juries saw basically the same evidence and came back with different results. And it probably had more to do with motive and character than anything else. But as I've said before, I like circumstantial evidence. It tells a story that people who struggle with expert witnesses like better. And almost all evidence in a trial is circumstantial anyway. You just hear that word on TV so much, it makes it sound like it's some kind of lesser evidence, but it's not. There are so many circumstantial things that tied both Betty and Peggy to James. But you've also got to remember the 2 pieces of physical evidence, the gun and the library book, were only tied to Betty. There are many, many folks who say if Betty is behind bars, then Peggy should be there too. Otherwise, both of them should have gotten off. But while Peggy can be tied to James through phone records, there is no physical evidence tied to her, and there is no motive, other than her sister might have promised her some money. That's not enough when you've got a first-grade teacher, pillar of her church with a squeaky clean reputation. Her calls with James could be explained away by hiring him for handyman jobs. It would definitely be hinky coincidences for me as a juror, but I can see why they chose not to convict. If they were being really fair and put her sister's trial out of their minds, I can see it. I think they truly did only consider the evidence against Peggy and not her sister or all the sensational press coverage. But Betty, on the other hand, was crucified at trial. I think one reason this case is still so controversial is that one of Betty's former lovers was a black man. He used to work for the city of Huntsville, but had moved to California. He was subpoenaed to come and confirm the sexual relationship. There really wasn't a parade of men who took the stand to demonstrate Betty's affairs, but the prosecution made sure and put the black man on. Betty Wilson and plenty of other journalists feel that the racism card, as she called it, was played at her trial. The prevailing thought was it's one thing to be a rich, cheating wife. It's another thing to do it with a black man. As disturbing as I do find that part of Betty's trial, I do not believe it was prejudicial enough to be the reason she was convicted. No, I think it's unfortunate that the prosecutors felt the need to put on this offensive show when they had a veritable mountain of evidence against Betty Wilson. She literally had said she would rather be a widow than a divorcee, and she got her wish. She just never dreamed she would be caught. And the state never dreamed that they couldn't convict the Sunday school teacher twin on the same evidence. We will really never know how involved Peggy was in the plot to kill Jack Wilson, but I don't think anyone really believes that she was not involved at all. She didn't merely introduce her sister to the killer. She herself played a part in all the phone calls and planning. She had just led a respectful life. She had no motive to kill her brother-in-law, and she certainly was never heard wishing him to be dead. That's why Peggy Lowe Peck leads a normal life of children and grandchildren and gardens and Sunday school to this day. And Betty Wilson Campbell will never see the outside of prison. But we must come back to Jack Wilson. He is often lost in the salacious, sensationalized saga of the twin sisters, when he is the victim and should not be forgotten. This man was a beloved doctor, friend, brother, father. I could go on and on. He was selfless, generous, kind, compassionate, and to those who loved him, irreplaceable. He was only 55 years old when he died, just beginning to have grandchildren. But instead, this poor man died in a vicious attack in his own home, a place where you should feel safe. Instead of a long life filled with kids, grandkids, nieces and nephews, birthday parties and Christmases, he was left to die alone, battered, in a pool of his own blood. It is a terrible tragedy for this family. It's been 32 years now since he was murdered, and though I'm sure he is still missed, I hope his family has found peace. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank and Erica Kelley. As usual, any editorial comments and opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Betty and Peggy's case has been suggested by so many people over the years, it's impossible to name them all. But thanks so much to those who wrote in asking for this fascinating story. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and click on the listener suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages, but please do come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm also on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.